I've been having a ton of fun using my Shaper Origin CNC router to make inlays, and my latest ones are these feather inlays. I really like how they turned out, and they're really fun to make. I'm going to show you how to make this trivet. It's the same techniques that I used for this charcuterie board, but it's just obviously on a little smaller scale. All right, before I get into the nitty-gritty, and there will be nitty-gritty, I want to talk about why I think this project is going to be a little bit more fun than your standard Shaper Origin project. First, you get all the fun of a standard Shaper Origin project, which means you get to use that wonderful tool, and you get these nice results where everything's all precise and it's just a blast to use the tool. You get all that fun, but you also get some creative input with this project because we're going to pick our template wood or our inlay wood by making these little templates. We're going to make 7 of these little templates for the 7 colorful pieces of the feather, and you'll be able to take each template and just decide, well, you know, exactly what wood do I want? Do I want it to go maybe that nice grain going in that direction? Oh yeah, that'd be pretty cool for that piece. And you're going to be able to do that for all 7 pieces. So you've got some creative input and some ability to make this project your own. The only special piece of equipment you're going to need for this project is a tapered inlay bit. And there's a link in the description to a very specific one. It's about $20. And the settings in the project are built around that specific bit. If there's some reason you can't get this bit, it's only $20. It's going to be easier if you just get this bit rather than trying to modify things for a similar but different bit. But if you can't get it for some reason, look at the Shaper Hub project. There's a link to a topic on the Shaper Origin user forum. If you just put a note in that saying, hey, I can't find the specific bit for the Feather Inlay project, I will help you, figure out what the settings ought to be for whatever bit you can get. Let's talk about the inlay material right now. So you need at least an 1/8 of an inch thick inlay material. If you're going to use 1/8 of an inch material, the first thing you ought to do is glue that material to the backer board, and you'll understand later why you have to do that with 1/8 of an inch material. If it's 3/16 or thicker, you'll be messing with the backer board later, but since this glue will have to dry, you can do this now while you're doing some other parts of the project. So that's only if you have 1/8 inch material. If you use 3/16 material like this, nothing to do right now, you can use 1/4 inch material. You can go even thicker. The minimum though is 1/8. The first step of the project is going to be to make the little templates out of 1/8 inch plywood. So there's 7 files, they're marked template. When you see the files, there'll be template files, 7 of those, and there'll be files called taper files. There's 8 of those, and it's the template files that you want for this. So get yourself some 1/8 inch plywood, put it down on a workstation shelf, double-sided tape, all the normal stuff, scan it, and then get those 7 taper files and drop those onto the 1/8 inch plywood, and we will cut them out. I've got the template files all laid out on the 1/8 inch plywood. And what I've done in Bench Pilot is I've selected the inside, the part that's the cutout for the little quote window. I'm going to look through to set those parts. And I've also selected a label for each one. It's labeled with the part number. And those are the parts I'm going to cut with the engraving bit. I've got the engraving bit in there, the tapered bit that I'm having you buy. And that's all set up in Z-Touch. So I'm going to do all of those cuts. The cut depths are all embedded. The bit size is weird using the tapered bit. It's always going to be a weird bit size, and you just have to look at the project to get the bit sizes. But in this case, it's going to be a bit size of 0.0289. So it's just a weird number. Hey, baby.
What you doing?
Oh, just working on a project.
Okay.
What's cooking?
I want to do something with Rocky that is, I'd rather have somebody standing there with me than not.
All right.
So if you have a chance,
Yeah.
you come over.
Yeah, I'd be there. And just looking at the template itself, it's hard to tell how it's going to be oriented. And so what I've done and included in the project is a map. So you ought to print this map out. You'll see it in the Shaper Hub project, and it just got all the little parts labeled. So when you go to figure out which grain direction you want or which exact little piece of wood you want, you'll know you know, what direction that ought to be going relative to the whole project. Let me show you what I mean by that. So here's my map, obviously, and I can take a template part like 2B, for example, and I can just place it right over there and know exactly, you know, what 2B is going to look like. And then on 2B, I want the grain on 2B to kind of go towards the outside, sort of like, you know, the feathery parts of a feather would be sort of pointing toward from the quill out to the edges. So I want the grain to run, you know, basically that direction, right? So I can just mark it on there how I want that grain to run. And there's that one. Then I'll just do the same thing over in 2A. And on this one, you know, I want the grain again to run from the quill kind of parallel to these lines over here. So I want the grain on 2A to kind of go that direction. And I'll just do that for the rest of the parts. So I've just kind of got out some wood that I think might look good on this project. I buy my wood, most of it, like this stuff right here. This is I think a 3/16 piece. And I get most of this stuff from Oak Couch Hardwoods, and they make these nice 3/16 thick pieces. Depending on what kind of wood it is, you know, it's going to be $5 to $15, you know, depending on how exotic it is. And I can make a lot of inlay parts out of that one piece, so it's not super expensive to use. This is a piece that an 1/8 inch thick, and I've already got it glued up on the backer board. And I've got some other stuff that's thicker. I don't know if I'm going to use it or not, but that's a 1/4 inch thick, and that's fine. You can mix and match the wood styles. Finally, I got some burl wood and resawed it, and I've just got some kind of really interesting grain patterns on that burl. It's not directional, right? So I wouldn't have kind of the feather look of the grain pointing away from the quill, but nonetheless, I think I may use that one maybe up in the tip of it just because it's got a really cool grain pattern, and it's a nice, you know, strong color to have up there in the tip. This is template 1, and that's the piece of burl I've decided I want for item 1. And so what I'm going to do here is just take a Sharpie and mark the inside of it so I'll know what direction it is. And then for whatever parts of this thing overlap the piece, I'm just going to mark those. This doesn't have to be critical on this outline, but you'll see why I'm doing that later. And then I'm just going to put a 1 right there to show that that's piece number 1. So it's okay to use a Sharpie, and you don't have to worry about ink stains on the wood because this is actually going to be the underside. When we cut it out, it's going to be flipped over to be installed in the inlay. So, you know, whatever ink stains are there are just going to be, you know, buried inside the trivet. I don't have a template for the quill, so I'm just getting something that's, you know, wide enough and that I can make long enough, and I'll just mark that up there. I know that's the quill. Next task is to cut along these edges of the template, more or less. It doesn't have to be exact or anything like that. And I'm going to use a bandsaw to do it because I have a bandsaw, but if you don't have a bandsaw, you know, it's not that big of a deal. These cuts don't have to be that great. Just need to get more or less around the edge of that. So you could use a jigsaw. If you don't have one of those, you could use a coping saw. So anyway, just to cut out those parts. I wasn't at all careful at the bandsaw. You know, I went over the line and didn't cut to the line in different spots. It just doesn't matter. You don't have to be that careful with those cuts. Also, you know, the entire template, the rectangle for the template does not have to fit on the wood. You can just see it here. This is part 4A, and there's a big part of the template that just doesn't show up on the actual wood. That's fine. That's not going to cause any problem at all. The next step is going to be to attach the parts to a piece of MDF backer board. I'm just going to use double-sided tape to do that. Now I've got 3 different thicknesses of parts. These are all 3/16. This one is, I don't know, about a quarter. I don't know exactly what it is. It's around a quarter. And these 2 are 1/8. And the 1/8 ones, I think I mentioned before in the video that I've already glued them to a backer board, so I don't need to do anything more with those at this stage. I can just put them aside. For this one, since it's thicker than the 3/16, it's going to get its own piece of backer board, and I'm going to have to mill this part separately from the other ones. For the rest of them, the ones that are 3/16, I'm just going to arrange them on this one piece of backer board. When I'm placing the parts on this backer board, it's helpful to more or less line up an edge with this top edge, because when I import the parts to go in and have Bench Pilot cut them, if I've left that, you know, pretty parallel, it doesn't matter really which edge, then, you know, I'm going to be able to not have to do wacky, weird rotations to make the file fit where I want it. I think this is a completely standard setup on Workstation. You know, it's obviously flush with the top of it. I've got the leg for the extended table kit, you know, so I've got it flush or level front to back, and that's helpful to get a consistent depth of cut. I'm just going to scan it. I'm going to visually place each file, you know, on the appropriate inlay wood. In the Shaper Hub project, the files that will be used to cut the inlay parts are marked taper. So, you know, I think we've got male 1 taper, male 2A taper, and so on for those, and then there's one for the quill as well. The initial cuts on the inlay parts are made with the tapered bit. In the project files, in the Shaper Hub project, there is a PDF that has the project settings. And in that, it includes just some information that's derived from an online calculator. I'm not going to go into all the details on that right now, but it shows me for the inlay parts, the males, that I'm going to use a depth of 0.15 inches, a bit size of 0.0289, a very weird bit size. These are all going to be outside cuts. There's no offset on these with the tapered bit. 6 passes, I think, is too much. I do want a roughing pass, but I think I can do these cuts and be very gentle with it with 3 passes, and including a roughing pass. And then we go in to preview the cuts, and I should have 5 of 5 ready to cut. That's all I need to do. I'll just zoom in and you can see. So with that, I can turn on the machine and make the cut. At this point, I'm swapping to a straight bit. I'm going to use an 8mm bit, but you could use a 1/4 inch bit. Just a straight flat bit is what you need at this point. We're going to be making a cut around all the parts with a straight bit, and what we don't want to do is cut into that tapered wall that we just cut with the tapered inlay bit. That's because the female parts, you know, the part on the trivet itself, the inset, if you will, is going to have a corresponding taper to it, and those 2 parts, the male and the female, will just wedge together really nicely. So we don't want to mistakenly cut away that taper from the parts we just cut. So if you look at the planning sheet, it's got an offset. It says flat bit offset 0.0145, and we need to dial that offset in before we make these cuts with the straight bit. Doesn't matter what size straight bit, that's just the offset you need. This is what the parts look like after cutting with that 8mm bit. And so what we're going to do with these parts next is I'm going to go in with the bandsaw and cut out this raised part out here. So I'll just have the part and the flat area around it that we just milled, and that's where we'll get it to the point that we're going to install it. When I cut these out on the bandsaw, I'm going to leave them attached to the backer board. So we'll end up with this little sandwich of a part and a backer board, and it won't have any of this stuff protruding because that would prevent it from being glued into the inlay. This is what a part looks like. It's got the this is the inlay part up here. If you look kind of closely, maybe you can tell that that little wall over there is tapered, and it's just all kind of sitting on top of this backer board. And what's going to happen is this is going to get flipped over and glued in to the inlay. There's the entire stack of parts. So now we're going to turn to the female side of the inlay. The trivet's mounted in workstation, and I need to get a scan of the whole thing. I want to be able to see the whole surface of it, and I also need to make a grid. When we cut the male parts, I didn't use a grid at all. I didn't really need it, but for this trivet part, I will need a grid. And the reason for that is we're first going to mill the 7 recesses for the colorful parts of the feather, and then we're going to take the trivet out of the workstation, glue those parts in, sand them flush, and then bring the trivet right back to workstation, and then we'll use a grid to place the quill. That'll be the last thing that we cut in place. And so the grid will let us get that quill in the same position for. All right, I'm stepping in from the future because when I got further on in this project, I realized I made a mistake right at this point. I don't want you to make the same mistake I made. What I didn't do and what you should do is just take a pencil when you make this grid and mark the corner that you gridded as 0, 0, right? The reason for that is you're going to have to come back and make a second grid later on in the process, and you want to put that grid using the same 0, 0 corner. I didn't do that. I used a different corner and thought, well, I'll just rotate the file around, it'll fit. It didn't fit quite right. So you can avoid my mistake. I'm going to show you how I fixed it, but it was fixable and it turned out just fine. But it was an extra step or two to fix it, and I want you to avoid that. I've scanned the trivet, I've created a grid, I've mounted the tapered bit, done a Z-touch on the tapered bit, so it's all ready to cut. At this point, you need to pull out this planning sheet again because the settings for these recesses, these female recesses, are different than the settings for the male parts. Now, it's the same bit, right? You'd think it would be the same bit size we're going to enter. No, it's not. It's a different bit size. The bit size we want to use and enter into for these recesses, the female parts, is 0.0418. So that's a much different bit size. The depth is going to be 0.12. Now, as this goes through, we're not cutting all the recesses. We're not going to cut the recess for the quill until we get all those other parts installed. So it'll be 7 of the 8 parts will get milled at this point on the recesses, not the quill. Once those initial taper cuts are done, I'm going to do 3 more inside cuts with increasing offsets each time. The first one is going to be 0.1, next 0.2, then 0.3. I'll just cut these in a single pass, no roughing pass or anything like that. The reason I'm doing these extra cuts is to make sure that a 1/8 inch router bit can just cut out all the corners in these, because that's what I'm going to use to clear the bottoms of the pockets. Here's what those cuts look like with the tapered bit. Now I'm going to use the 1/8 bit to pocket out the rest of it. A few observations about pocketing those recesses. One, I'm going to use a straight bit to pocket them, and because of that I need to use an offset. It shows up on the planning sheet as a flat bit offset. I'm going to use 0.022 as my offset. That's again so I don't wreck those tapered walls that we cut with the tapered bit. Second thing is, I've got bench pilot, so I'm just going to tell it to make a pocket cut. I don't have to follow that with an inside cut because that's how bench pilot behaves. If you're not using bench pilot and you make a pocket cut, you need to finish it with an inside cut. Again, you've got to keep the offset, but you need to finish it with an inside cut because a pocket won't cut all the way to the line. Bench pilot just does a terrific job on pockets. They're really clean. If I see any little things like this in the corner, I'll just pick them out with a scalpel. It looks like maybe up here. Yeah, no, it comes right out. I like to have a little bit of sandpaper and just kind of hit see if there's any just fuzzies left from the, upcut router bit. So I'll just go along there and just super lightly sand it. It doesn't have to be anything. There should be a gap between the part and the board. That's in the parlance of this sort of inlay, it's called the saw gap, and that's because some people will actually saw off this piece of the inlay. I don't saw it off. I use a sander to sand it down, but that's called the saw gap, and that should be there. And it is something that you want, because you don't want this part of the wood to bottom out before you've fully seated that inlay. So that's by design, that there's a little gap there. It just should be even all the way around it. One of the challenges for the glue up is I can't do it all at once, right? If I glue that part in, I'm not gluing either one of those in because the backer boards interfere, right? I can't reach that. I want to try to see if there's a way I can get 3 of them in and not just 2. All right, with a little bit of surgery, I'm going to be able to glue in these 3 parts, and that'll leave me with 4 more, which will probably be, another 2 rounds of gluing. The first set of parts are dry, so I'm sanding them down. This is easier on a drum sander. I have a drum sander, but I realize a lot of people don't. So just as a proof of concept, I'm just using a random orbit sander, 60 grit paper. It just has to be flush at this stage. It doesn't have to be smooth. I think that shows that we get a really tight bit. And as I rub my finger along there, you just can't feel the gap even with your fingernail. I just love the tight fit on that tapered bit inlay. I use a paint scraper to pull the backing board off of there and get the tape off of it. And when it's been clamped for a few hours for that glue to dry, the tape gets really hard to scrape off. And you want to be careful. You don't want to pull the inlay out of its setting. And it's possible also, I don't know if you can see it there, to tear the wood a little bit, which is fine. That's going to get sanded down. But if you tore it too much and it got into the bottom part of the inlay, that'd be a problem, obviously. All right, we're almost done with this thing. All the colorful parts, the pretty colorful parts are all glued in, sanded flush. I think it looks pretty good. The last piece we've got to do on this is the quill, right? Feathers have a quill. That's going to be a piece of dark wood that kind of runs here. To do that, we've got to drop this back on the workstation. We've got to scan it again. We've got to grid it again, and then that'll let us drop that file into, almost the exact same spot. I've used the tapered bit to make the cut for the quill, and I've also made a second cut with the tapered bit and a 0.1 offset, and then I think it did a third cut with a 0.2 offset. And I could continue going like that and just adding more and more offset to clear that area for the quill. It's too narrow to fit the 1/8 bit. So your choices are just what I said. You just keep doing more and more offsets with the tapered bit until it clears it, or you can switch over to a 1/16 bit to clear it. I think the 1/16 bit gives you a cleaner pocket. If you use the tapered bit, you're probably going to have to go back with a scalpel and clean up some little fuzzy stuff inside that pocket. So I'm going to switch to a 1/16 bit and just clear that thing out. Just a reminder, if you're going to clear any of those recesses, those female recesses with any straight bit, I'm using a 1/16, I still have to enter that offset. I think the offset is 0.022 or something like that. You can look it up on the information sheet that comes with the project, but don't forget to do the offset. If you don't do it, you're going to wreck those tapered walls. Now, you need to be careful when you glue in the quill. It goes over and covers some of the previous inlay parts you've already put in. So there's a little bit of a hollow. It's only, I think, 2/100ths of an inch. It's not very much, but it's something. And it would be noticeable if you used so much force on this that you crushed these parts down into that glue gap. So I'm just going to use hand pressure, moderate hand pressure, and put those in there without, jamming them so tight that I'm going to cause a problem with the prior inlay parts. All right, while this thing is drying, it's going to be a couple of hours until I can pry it off and look at the final product. I'm looking forward to that. But in the meantime, I want to talk about a little bit of just some alternatives for producing this or some other inlays if you want to do that. You recall that we had to scan and grid this thing twice, once for these colorful parts and then another time for the quill. An alternative to multiple scans and grids is to create just a table where you can clamp things to it. And I'll talk about it here and show you. But basically on this table, which is quite a lot bigger than the regular workstation table, I've got a stop over here, and the workstation fence acts as another stop. And then I've just got some bench dog clamps where I can just clamp that thing right up there. And if I use this, which I normally would, right, just when I'm doing these things on my own, not for a YouTube demonstration, I would just scan it once, drop the file in once, and then I can go remove it, do whatever work I need to do, and bring it back into the same position. And that's especially important for some other inlays. I've got some that have 5 or 6 different layers on them where it's got to come out and back and out and back, and I don't want to have to be re-scanning and re-gridding every time. This particular one is kind of a jumbo piece. It's big enough that you can move the clamps out here, and it'll fit a 12 by 18 inch cutting board. And so I do use it for that. And by the way, Bench Pilot will cut anywhere on that 12 by 18 surface, so it works just fine. I've also got a smaller version of this if you don't want a huge one, and you can look on Shaper Hub and find those projects, and I'll have links for them in the video description as well. Another thing I just generally want to talk about is, what can you do if you like this and you want to design it on your own? And make modifications to it, maybe make a bigger one, maybe come up with your own different designs. Well, the part that you want to start with, if you're sitting down at a computer and you want to sort of reverse engineer this process, is the female files, right? That's what you're going to see when you're up on the computer screen, and that's the final orientation. The male files are all flipped over because they've got to be flipped over to be cut, flipped back in to be glued in the right position. So if you, like I say, just take the female file and open it up on your computer, and you can fiddle around with it. Maybe you could just copy the whole thing a couple of times and have an array of feathers on like a cutting board or something like that. I do have a video dedicated to designing for this sort of tapered bit inlay that goes into what sort of how do you determine the bit size? How do you determine the depth you want? How do you design to make sure your corners aren't too tight in the inlay? So you might want to take a look at that. We should be finished with this, but we're not. That's because I made a mistake. My mistake was when I gridded this thing, I had to grid it twice, right? You scan it twice, you grid it twice. First grid and scan was for the colorful parts. Second was for the quill. I think I gridded it from a different corner each time. The mistake was I didn't keep track when I was gridding the first time of what my reference corner was. And that was a pretty boneheaded mistake. I should know better than that, but there's a mistake I made. So when you're gridding the first time, just put a mark, for where your 0, point should be, and go right back to that same 0, point for the second grid. I think that would avoid the mistake. I think gridding is accurate enough that you could place this quill without the mistake. Problem with it is the quill is a little bit too low, and so it left some of the underlying wood exposed. It's maybe just a couple thousandths of an inch. I don't know, maybe a little bit more than that. Maybe it's 1/100 of an inch. I don't know. It's pretty thin, but it's noticeable. So what I'm going to do is just go into my design software. I'll get the female file open. I will do a contour adjustment on the quill to make it a little bit wider. I'll save that file. I'll save it to the same file, and then I'll make the male part. And the male part, all you do is just flip it horizontally, and that takes the female part and makes it into the male part. So I'll mill a new male part, I'll mill the female part out, and we'll glue in the replacement quill and see how it looks tomorrow. Here's the final trivet, including that replacement quill, and it just looks perfect. I mean, I wish the quill was a little bit narrower. I had to make it wider to do the fix, but it still comes out looking great, and nobody's going to know that the quill was wider than originally designed. It's time for me to beg for likes and subscriptions and all that kind of stuff. Seriously, if you like the video, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button. I don't make money off this channel. What I'd really enjoy is just hearing comments. You know, if you make one of these, send me a picture of it. I'd love to see it. Anyways, hope to see you back here. Bye.